Today, we're honored to have with us Professor Mathew John, faculty at the School of Law, BML Munjal University. He works on issues bearing public law, constitutional studies, and the history of law in modern India. Professor John is the author of the critically acclaimed book, India's Communal Constitution, Law, Religion, and the Making of a People, which offers a compelling analysis of how India's constitutional framework continues to grapple with colonial legacies of religious and communal categorization. His work sheds new light on the complex interplay between law, religion, and identity in modern India. We look forward to discussing his insights on minority rights and the evolution of constitutional protections. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I look forward to our conversation.
So, Professor, in your book, you discuss the colonial roots of religious categorization in India. Now, do you perceive Articles 26 to 30 as a continuation of the communal ideologies enshrined in the Constitution, or do you view them as provisions guaranteeing groups their freedom to practice their religions and customs?
Right. So the way to look at this is that it is possible to interpret Articles 26 to 30 in a communal fashion. Right? So that's the argument that I have made in the book. And so I'm guessing you've had a chance to, to skim through the book at least. So if you look at the introductory chapter, the place where I begin is the question of the people. Right? So our constitution starts off with that phrase, we the people. Right? So I ask the question, who are the people who authorize the Indian constitution? On whose authority are we giving ourselves this constitution? Right? Now, we may think that the answer is straightforward, but it's not as simple as it seems. Right? So what I'm saying is that there are many ways in which we can think about the people. And what I'm trying to argue for in this book is to say that there's a specific form in which the people have been thought about, which I'm trying to characterize as communal. Right? So, so for instance, we just take a rough scan of through, if I were to roughly pull together some of the themes in the book, one could think of the people as a liberal people. Now that's there in the introductory chapter. Right? So what is a liberal people? Very, very broadly, it is the idea of the people thought of as a collection of individual citizens. Right? Now you can think of the people, in exclusionary nationalist terms. Now this is of interest to me because this is what I'm calling a communal constitution. Now you can think of people in other terms as well. You can think of the people in federal terms, and perhaps in a sort of broader, bordering on constitutional, perhaps sociological, political ways of thinking about the people. You can talk about something that's outside this frame, someone like Gandhi or Tagore, right, who had dissenting ways of thinking about who the people were in India. We'll come to that a little later, if it comes up in conversation. But my primary concern is that there is the possibility that our constitution can be thought of in communal terms, by which I mean exclusionary nationalist terms, which then I trace to, colonial history. Right? So now it is that colonial history that produces that I'm arguing produces a communal vision of India, and this communal vision of India, it's not the dominant vision of our constitution, but slips into the interpretation of our constitution. So this is the steps through which I reach Articles 26 to 30, insofar as I do in the book. Right now, I don't know, if that's answered your question in a straightforward way. Do you have? Let me stop there and ask you if if you'd like to ask another question, or if you'd like me to elaborate on any one of these steps that I've taken up to this point.
Certainly, Professor. If you could kindly elaborate on the colonial roots of the same. So we had the divide and rule policy. How does that perpetuate from there onward?
Right. So let's go back one. Let's try to retrace the colonial to the colonial to the communal. Right. So now in the if you look at my introductory chapter, I say that you can trace this thing that I'm calling the communal constitution, which is this exclusionary nationalist conception of the people as a whole. Where does it come from, if at all it's there in the constitution? If it's there in the constitution, one has to give evidence, right? the form in which I'm giving evidence is by saying that there is a colonial way in which we have thought, the colonial state thought of us, perhaps we thought of ourselves as well in these terms, the way in which the people in India have been characterized, right? And that I have worked out through what I'm three processes or phases, perhaps, depending on how you look at it. So I've called them toleration, reform, and representation. Very broadly, by toleration, what I've tried to outline in the book is to say that the colonial state tolerated Indian religions because they felt obliged to do so. But in tolerating, they felt that they were a people underwritten by foundational doctrine. Right? So they said that India has peoples broadly understood as Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and so on. Each of these communities are underwritten by some founding doctrinal concepts that make them a people. Right? Now, the moment you do that, you have categorized India into various groups. And this categorization then went on for a very long time. Right? But if it was just the colonial state that made this kind of categorization of India, it would have had very little power. Indians also started participating in this form of categorization. That's where I talk about the reform part of the story. Right? Now, Indians, we were interested in reworking ourselves. We look at it in very positive terms, but much of this reworking of ourselves also took place in silos. Right? So we talked of Hindu reform, of Muslim reform, of various sectarian forms of reform. Right? And once this form of thinking of ourselves in groups acquired currency, then it became the very basis on which colonial politics developed, what you were calling divide and rule. Right? So we said that India is divided into these various groups. They are under the control of the British. The British said, can we at some future point think of giving them rule? Their answer always was no. And why? Because they are divided into these groups: Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Maratha, and you can go on and on, right? At what is the point? 1909, there was the emergence of separate electorates. So there was always the belief that Indians could be taught to rule themselves. Though eventually, by the time we got independence, we had to kick the British out. We had to push them out, right? But they did initiate constitutional reform in India. Right? And that constitutional reform that was initiated by them was in these identity silos. Right? So that was a further reiteration that India is a country divided but deeply divided amongst these identity formations. Right? And now that was not what we wanted to institutionalize in our constitution. But what I'm arguing is that so for instance, if we look at that moment of independence, Pakistan was formed on an exclusionary nationalist idea of who their people were meant to be. India was not quite organized in these terms, but this form of thinking about who the people were, as intellectual ways of thinking about who the people were, there were very many ways of thinking about who the people were, as I've just suggested to you. Right? So this communal way of thinking about the people was also available to us. Right? And then, so what I do is that I look at chapter in the religious freedom chapter. What I do is I trace the way in which this imagination works its way into the practice of the Indian Constitution, primarily through the imprint of one big judge, from the state that you're located in, Justice P.B. Gajendra Gadkar, a Sanskrit scholar of great renown. In a series of cases in the 1960s, he changed the way in which the interpretation of articles, especially Articles 25 and 26, were organized, right? Which allowed the Supreme Court to go into what is the character of a religion. And in doing so in the way that Justice Gajendra Gadkar did, he used a colonial way of thinking about what is religion and what is Hindu religion in particular, which actually Hindu, Muslim, he did with the Ajmer Dargah case was about the Islamic faith. There's a Satsangi case which is about who is a Hindu, right? So it's that doctrinalization of religion that took place at that time which has then been carried on in many other cases. And when that way, when that kind of interpretation of the Constitution is taken to extreme cases, we could have the entire polity divided into us and them, friend and enemy, inside and outside, and that's what I'm talking about as communal in Articles 26 to 30. So it's a long-winded way of getting to your question.
I think you've traced the lineage quite well, Professor. Thank you so much. Over to Parushni.
Yes, sir. So building upon your response, if these communal ideas are indeed remnants of colonial heritage, can the decolonization of thought through a decolonized interpretation of thought of the Constitution be effective? For instance, could this approach lead to the replacement of the essential religious practice doctrine with perhaps more objective tests, as suggested by Justice D.Y. Chandrachud in the Sabarimala judgment, as well as by Justice Dhulia in the Supreme Court hijab judgment?
Right. Thanks for that question, Parushni. Now, yes, as I've once again suggested in one of the the chapter on religious freedom, I think I call it chapter 1 of my book, I have suggested that it is indeed a possibility that we could in the future think of the mediating doctrine that works through Articles 25 and 26 as one that follows Justice Chandrachud's position in in Sabarimala, for instance. Right? That's very well a future possibility. Right? But I wouldn't quite call that decolonizing. Right? So as I was saying that decolonizing has and perhaps we can talk about that in a bit. What I would call that is that what I would call that way of thinking about the Constitution is picking on a interpretative framework of specific provisions of the Constitution, in this case, Articles 25 and 26 in particular, and interpreting them in ways that best fit in with the frame of our Constitution. And I broadly think that the frame of our Constitution is one that seeks to affirm, some idea of a liberal conception of who we are, and therefore that the 1960s turn of the Supreme Court is perhaps the wrong way to push ahead with understanding religious freedom. So perhaps Justice Chandrachud's idea of pushing ahead with elaborating the contours of Articles 25 and 26 via constitutional morality may be a future course that we could adopt. But will that be decolonization? I'm not quite sure. These are various interpretative options that a judiciary has available to it in what is a liberal secular democracy. Right? Now, it's not to say that going down this doctrinalized form of thinking about religion, as Justice Gajendragadkar did, is necessarily going to make us, a communal state. Right? What I've tried to say is that one route to that is the communalization of our polity, which we must be wary of. So that's the form of interpretation that I adopt in the book.
Right, sir. So, what, according to you, would look like a decolonized constitution?
Right. I'm not even sure if the Constitution itself. See, now one can think. I would broadly think of decolonization on two frames, right? So one, one can look at decolonization from the perspective of nationalism, right? So sometime by the end of the 19th century, there emerged amongst Indians across the subcontinent, Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis and the Burmese, there emerged some idea of some kind of nationalist self-awareness, right? And this nationalist self-awareness grew into a sentiment that believed that colonial rule, which did not allow for representative government in India, had to be pushed out. Right? So every one of these various groups, whether it's in India, whether it's in Pakistan, whether it's in Bangladesh, whether it's in Sri Lanka, whether it's in Burma, all of them were interested in the question of decolonizing themselves insofar as it meant self-determination. Right? And if you look at that, that problem of self-determination, every one of them had to rely on, what were local cultural idioms. Right? So if you look at a book like, Nehru's Discovery of India, he was deeply invested, in the Buddhist heritage that we have, in the Guptas and the Mughals and so on. He was interested in India's past, and that past he tried to weave into the India that he saw coming. Right? However, if you think of, if you think of the and I suppose another way to take it would be to say that there are various other ways in which one could think of the axes of solidarity that would pull the nation together such that they could work towards independence or decolonization or pushing the colonizer out. Right? Now you can think of decolonization from another way, which is to say that this and this is the Gandhian way, which is much less employed in India today. Right? So Gandhi is dismissed as someone who's impractical and fanciful, and who doesn't have a sense of who doesn't understand modernity and and so on. And the Gandhian approach to decolonization was to say that there is something that the colonizer came with, which is his forms of knowledge, the forms of rule that he brought in India, which were fundamentally antithetical to the ways of life of the Indian subcontinent. And he tried to pull together what I would argue is a decolonizing framework. Right? So he said, what is Hind Swaraj? Right? I don't know, you must have read this book, Hind Swaraj, in your classes up to this. You're in the second year, I'm guessing, if you've done constitutional law. By this time, most of us, would have read some fragments of Hind Swaraj. Right? Now, the question is, what does Hind Swaraj mean? Now, the knee-jerk reaction that I found in many of my classes where I've taught Gandhi's Hind Swaraj is that it means pushing the British out. Right? But what Gandhi said is that he's perfectly happy, to have an India that that could be deeply entwined with the British. But what he is not happy at all is the forms of rule that the British brought to India. Right. So, and he wants us. So, for instance, he let's just take one example on the very question of nationalism. And he said it is fanciful to think that you can have a state that is associated with one kind of identity. Right? And so he says, there's this, like you talked about divide and rule earlier, Disha, and he says that the British have told us, Gandhi says, that we are divided amongst Hindus and Muslims. Right? But he said, that is, nothing can be further from the truth. Like in a family, people fight. Your brothers and sisters fight with each other. Like likewise, Indians have fought with each other forever. Right? But that does not mean that national identity is organized on divisions per se between Hindus and Muslims. And so therefore he tried to explain this. Right? The forms in which he tried to explain this is by saying, look at what is this thing that you call Hindu. Right? And he says it's not about putting a boundary around a people who you can call Hindu, but it's a tradition that thinks about how to search for truth. That's what Gandhi thought was his, and that's how Gandhi expounded or explained his conception of being a Sanatani Hindu. Right? And he says strengthening these ways of being together in the subcontinent is a form of both decolonization as also building a new society. And building a new society was for Gandhi the future of a strong, of a strong nation. So that would be the trajectory that I would associate with decolonization. Right? And in the first example, now you pick anyone, whether it is from the right to the left, they're all interested in decolonization, but as transfer of power. But someone like Gandhi was invested in that decolonization question much more deeply.
Of course, sir. So further on, the Constitution often serves as a channel through which the ruling party shapes its interpretation to align with its own ideology. So how can we prevent this and ensure that the Constitution is interpreted as it was originally written?
I am not quite sure. I would rephrase that question and say that the Constitution is a battleground of ideas, right? And that battleground of ideas involves ruling parties, parties who are not in rules, social actors. There are all kinds of forces that that are vying for influence. And if you want influence for your point of view, articulate it as clearly as you can and fight for it intellectually.
Yeah. Over to you, Disha.
Yes, we do have one last question for you, Professor. So, what you had mentioned that there is a communalization of the Constitution which has been happening ever since we gained our independence. So, could you suggest any alternative approaches that can be adopted in order to prevent a further communalization of the Constitution, or we prevent it or we interpret it in a manner that prevents its communalization? Because, as you said, it's a ground of ideas. So how do we stop that from being perpetuated?
Well, how does one address that question? One is to foreground the danger of communalization, right? So the danger of communalization, as I said earlier, is that you think of ourselves as, as a state for just one kind of people. Now that's something that one must, if communalization is a problem, that's what is a problem. Right? And our constitution is not necessarily getting increasingly more communal, is not getting communalized, per se. Right? It's not that we have now suddenly communalized our constitution. Our constitution continues to be a battleground of ideas. Right? However, insofar as some of these ideas are gaining ground, well, you have to meet idea with idea, right? So perhaps, as we were saying, you take again, I don't know if it's a silver, it's not a magic solution, it's not a silver bullet, but pick up essential religious practices. Perhaps working our way outside the doctrinalization of religion, as I have argued, has taken place since Justice Gajendra Gadkar, and maybe thinking of alternatives, perhaps the one that Justice Chandrachud has suggested in Sabarimala, maybe one way of thinking through these problems, right? But there's no one, one solution to a problem as large as this. So,
Of course, sir.
yeah, that's an unsatisfactory response, but I have to leave it at that.
That's fair, though. It's a tricky question, though.
Thank you so much, sir. Your insights on secularism, communal categories, and constitutional paradoxes made for a truly engaging and thought-provoking conversation here at BITS Law's Constitutional Society. Thank you again for joining us on this podcast to discuss India's communal constitution. We are grateful for your time and perspective.
Thank you. It was fun talking.
Thank you, sir.